This lecture that covers part of the digestive system will include specifically major events that occur in the mouth, which is the oral cavity, your pharynx, and your esophagus. It's going to include processes such as chewing, salivation, starting the digestion of carbohydrates and specifically starches, and also the process of swallowing. The first one we're going to look at is the process of mastication, which is just a fancy word for chewing. You may or may not have learned of some of the muscles in Anatomy and Physiology 1 involved in chewing. The masseter muscle, your temporalis muscle, but you also have your medial and lateral pterygoid muscles. The medial pterygoid muscle is not shown on this image, but all these muscles are involved in the process of chewing. Chewing, the purpose of chewing is to help to start breaking down the food mechanically to increase surface area for various enzymes to digest. Plus also, if you don't chew your food properly, it makes it much more difficult to swallow the food. Now, all the muscles involved in mastication are innervated by the trigeminal nerve, and specifically the mandibular branch of the trigeminal nerve. Now, while you're chewing, you're also having the process of salivation. So if you ever, these dogs thankfully are not salivating because it'd be a lot grosser. But if you ever watch your dog sitting there watching you eat, they sit there and they salivate. Now, salivation is going to provide a very important function, but we'll also show you, look at the process of control of salivation. And one of it's just looking at the food, like you see the dog's like, oh, I'm going to get something to eat, so I'm going to start to salivate. But salivation does have a number of different functions. Now, and remember in lab, you would have looked at the various glands. You have the parotid glands, which are on either side near your ear. You've got your sublingual glands, which are underneath the tongue, and you've got your submandibular glands. All of these have various cells, mucus cells, which secrete mucus, and serous cells, which secrete a watery substance, or what they call serous substance, that has the enzyme salivary alpha amylase. It's the alpha amylase which will start the digestion specifically of starches. It does not digest disaccharides or monosaccharides. It's going to digest polysaccharides and specifically starches. Now, if you look here, this kind of tells you, go over some of the major functions. One of them says does begin carbohydrate digestion, and specifically, again, starches. The proper activity of the salivary alpha amylase needs an optimal pH, and so the saliva is also going to help to keep the proper pH anywhere between about 6.5 and 7.5 for that enzyme to work properly. It will start to digest those starches into a disaccharide called maltose. Now, maltose will be continued to be digested later on as we go through, but it's not going to be the complete digestion of starches. Do not take place in the mouth. It's just the farthest you can get down is to maltose. The saliva also helps to lubricate the food, makes it much easier to swallow. If you don't produce enough saliva, it's very difficult to swallow. Helps to start binding that food together. It also has IgA and lysozyme. Both of those are going to be protective. You got antibacterial functions of it, because you do have a lot of bacteria in your mouth, and also the bacteria in your mouth, they produce acids, and so the acids again would help. Well, now again, they would not make it the proper pH for your mouth, but usually your mouth does not get that acidic. But the acids produced by the bacteria in your mouth, the bicarbonate that is found in saliva, helps to neutralize that and helps to prevent against tooth decay. So you hear about like 4 out of 5 dentists recommend a certain gum to chew. Chewing gum helps to stimulate salivation, which does help to protect against the bacterial acids in your oral cavity. Now, the control of salivation is completely mediated through the autonomic nervous system. You have sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers that innervate the salivary glands. You notice in the gray here, what do you see? Right in here and up here, through the cervical ganglion, those are sympathetic fibers. The sympathetic fibers mostly, if they do stimulate any bit of salivation, it's very viscous. It's not going to stimulate a lot of the serous fluid. The mucus will be more mucus, be very viscous, and overall it tends to be relatively inhibitory because it also will decrease blood flow to the glands. So when you're in fight or flight response, you're not pretty much need to salivate a lot. Mainly salivation is a rest and digest, which is the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. And you'll notice we have two cranial nerves that will be important in salivation. You have cranial nerve number 7, which you see here, the facial nerve. So that's facial nerve. And we have 9, which is the glossopharyngeal nerve. The glossopharyngeal nerve will innervate the submandibular, or sorry, not submandibular. Yes, the glossopharyngeal will innervate the parotid glands via the otic ganglion. It's something you should have learned about in AMP1, and I still could test you on that. So the otic ganglion innervates the parotid gland. Then you have the facial nerve via the submandibular ganglion will innervate the submandibular and sublingual glands. Now, what stimulates the salivation process? So you'll see, well, seeing food, smelling food, tasting the food, just thinking about the food is going to send sensory information to, and in this case, this is going to be a reflex. The integration center is going to be located in the medulla oblongata. So that's where the salivatory center is. And that will then send motor input to the various salivary glands. So a number of different things can stimulate salivation, and it's all mediated through reflexes via the medulla oblongata. It would be considered an autonomic reflex. Then the next process that will be involved, so you've chewed up your food, increasing surface area, mixing it with the saliva, help moisten the food, start the digestion of some of the carbohydrates. Then you need to swallow the food. The term for swallowing is deglutition. There are 3 phases involved. Buccal phase, this is going to be voluntary. Buccal, remember, refers to cheeks. So this is why the food is between your cheeks, so it's in your mouth. The pharyngeal phase and the esophageal phases, they're named according to where we are. So pharyngeal phase is when the bolus, and refer to the food as a bolus. So a bolus of food will be in the pharynx. The esophageal phase is when the bolus of food hits the esophagus. The pharyngeal and esophageal phases are involuntary. These are going to be very important. What's going to help kind of control these phases will be all via the nervous system. And a very important component would be the vagus, but a number of other different cranial nerves will be involved in deglutition. But also there's going to be a component of the enteric nervous system, which is the GI tract's native nervous system, that will play a role in deglutition to help aid movement of food down the throat and esophagus. So the first phase is referred to as the buccal phase. So the buccal phase, the food is in the mouth, the tongue has just moved that bolus of food back towards the pharynx. That will then trigger the initiation of the swallowing reflex. Now the swallowing reflex is the most complicated reflex in the body. It may not seem like, wow, swallowing is that complicated. Yes, there's a lot of different nerves involved, a lot of different things, motor pathways involved in the whole process of swallowing. So we got the first phase, which is buccal. The food's just in the between the cheeks. You just move the tongue and move the bolus of food to the back of the throat. Then what we're going to do is we're going to trigger that swallowing reflex, which is involuntary. You have receptors, touch receptors on the sides of your throat, also the uvula. That's going to send sensory information up to the swallowing center, which is in the brainstem, specifically medulla oblongata and pons. So you kind of notice after a while that the brainstem is important in a lot of different important reflexes in your body. Blood pressure regulation is important in regulation of gases, oxygen, carbon dioxide. Here now we're just talking about swallowing. So a lot of number, and you have them in your notes, the various cranial nerves that are going to be involved, in the motor output. Notice that some of the things that happen, I want you to just wait so you don't have to try to memorize everything that happens, is think logically. Why would the soft palate close over your nasal cavity? So the soft palate moves up over the nasal cavity because, one, you don't want food coming out through your nose. We know sometimes that happens, but hopefully it doesn't because it's kind of unpleasant. The epiglottis then is going to cover up the larynx. So the food doesn't go into the respiratory tract. We want to just go down the esophagus. So that's pretty important. Remember also you have receptors in the vestibular fold. So if food does hit that, it will trigger a cough reflex to try to make sure the food doesn't go down into the respiratory tract. Another thing that's going to happen during that pharyngeal phase is we have a sphincter located in the upper esophagus. That is going to relax to let foods now start to go into the esophagus. Right now we're pretty much in the pharynx. So the peristalsis is going to be triggered, which is going to allow us to start to move the things down into the esophagus. So the last one, I don't want that. So the last part is, you see, it's here in the esophagus. So the upper esophageal sphincter has relaxed. The bolus of food hits the esophagus. One thing is going to happen, that's close the upper esophageal sphincter so things don't go backwards. And then the stretch of the smooth muscle of the esophagus will trigger a primary peristaltic wave. So the trigger of peristalsis, we should say the first peristaltic wave, is what we call the primary peristaltic waves, is triggered by stretch of the smooth muscle. So this again is kind of like a reflex. You stretch out that muscle, it's going to trigger peristalsis, and the peristalsis is going to allow food to move down towards the stomach. Now, if that primary peristaltic wave is not sufficient, it will trigger another wave because you're still stretching that smooth muscle, and food will continue, then hopefully will make its way down into the stomach. But simultaneously, when you're triggering peristalsis, is the lower esophageal sphincter, which is the cardiac sphincter associated with the stomach, or they also refer to as the gastroesophageal sphincter. That should relax so food can go into the stomach. Simultaneously, though, too, is, you see here, we call it receptive relaxation. Up here, this is the fundic region, or the fundus of the stomach. That should relax to kind of allow that bolus of food to kind of have room to enter, and you'll have that, obviously also have the relaxation of the lower esophageal sphincter right here. That's triggered as a reflex that is mediated via the vagus. So the vagus nerve is going to be very important in helping to trigger receptive relaxation. And ultimately, it was all started or initiated because of stretch of that smooth muscle. But the stretch of that smooth muscle will trigger contractions, and a lot of things that help with the contractions throughout the GI tract is the enteric nervous system. And with the muscle, it's going to be the myenteric plexus that will be involved in controlling motility through the GI tract. And the reason why I mention this, because of something I'm going to show you right now, is there's a condition called achalasia. Literally means no relaxation. So A is referred to no, achalasia is relaxation. Achalasia, if they don't... Sorry about that. The dog, of course, goes crazy. So achalasia if you don't precede it by any other word, it's automatically assumed referring to what's going on in the esophagus. But achalasia is any time in which smooth muscle fibers fail to relax, which would mean in case of sphincters stay closed and they don't open when they should. So people with achalasia, and again I said if they don't have anything preceding it, it's automatically assumed it has to refer to the esophagus. These people it's very difficult for the esophagus to move food down towards the stomach. The lower esophageal sphincter fails to relax, but also the movements, the peristalsis through the esophagus is impaired. They believe that in part it's due to damage to the myenteric neurons that line the esophagus, which would be needed for to help with that reflex. You've got to send this sensory information. Also to help with the movement of the food down towards the lower esophageal sphincter. Now there's a number of different treatments for it, but I'm showing you one in which they did surgery. Is here on the left you see this esophagus is very large. Okay, that's a pretty large esophagus, and you see a constriction here. So what happens is kind of food kind of like backs up. It's going to be very difficult for food to enter the stomach. Then get what we call mega esophagus. What they did with this individual, well, they could have done two different things. They can cut the lower esophageal sphincter, or they can go and widen the area of the esophagus that's involved. Now, obviously, problem with this, if they cut the lower esophageal sphincter or widen if it's closer to where the stomach is you're going to have problems with reflux. That's always an issue. Now, another condition that I want to talk about, last thing I want to talk about before you move to the stomach is, oh, sorry, wrong one. Where did my swallow syncope thing go? One sec. This is what I wanted. Swallow syncope. This is a condition where you have temporary loss of consciousness while you're swallowing. So this is a case of an individual where they're showing you the number of episodes that she had, and you notice correspond to 8 a.m., noon, and 6 p.m. These are times when this individual would be eating. And the episode you see was associated with severe episodes of bradycardia, which is heart rate's extremely low. Now, would it make sense that if you had severe bradycardia, that could lead to loss of consciousness because blood pressure would be low. And what was happened is, and it's kind of, you may have a hard time kind of seeing the ECG, which you see here, is there's periods of times again when she would be eating or swallowing, is it led to almost complete atrioventricular block, and that would definitely lead to problems with the heart and eventually also blood pressure. They believe it's somehow have to do with some altered feedback involved in vagal reflexes. The swallowing triggers, vagal reflexes are involved in swallowing, but instead of the normal pathway involved in just let's get the food down the esophagus, it gets sent to the heart, and again the vagus does innervate the heart and slow down the heart rate significantly. Also going to affect AV conduction. Is these individuals, when they swallow, which is the parasympathetic response, is lowering of heart rate's parasympathetic, but this is kind of ridiculous where you lose consciousness while you're eating. The treatment for this, which it's hard for people to, it kind of gets overlooked for a long period of time. You have to have a really good doctor to pick up on this, but the only treatment for this is they'll have to have a pacemaker put in. Because individuals who've had this is the one, I believe this individual that this was involved with, she stopped eating she looked like she was anorexic because she passed out, and it was mainly like certain sandwiches and certain things that would trigger it the most. She couldn't eat sandwiches, and I think they said she couldn't eat like fizzy drinks. But I think she was a British woman, but you can double check because I have the thing here, so you can always look it up if you want. So this will be the end of the major events that take place in the oral cavity, pharynx, and esophagus.